I went to lunch with my lawyer and saw my wife and her lover together at the next table, so close, so intimate, that everything inside me seemed to melt into silence. Her laughter, light and relaxed, was the same one I knew with my eyes closed, but at that moment, it sounded like a stab. The touch of her hands on the table, the way she leaned towards him, as if she were rediscovering the youth she said she had lost with me, made me understand, it wasn't the first time, it wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. A premeditated betrayal, cultivated in secret, while I still believed that us could resist anything. I looked at the man sitting in front of me, the lawyer, and said in a firm voice, but with my chest in ruins, I'm going to file for divorce right now. This is my lawyer and we already have what we need. May you be happy with your new partner, but don't look for me anymore. You've destroyed everything we built together. She froze. She didn't know what to say. And inside, I screamed in pain, but on the outside, I maintained the posture of someone who doesn't beg. Of someone who, even with a shattered heart, gets up from the table with dignity. That night, the silence inside the house seemed to scream. Every corner echoed the past. The couch where we watched movies in our arms, the kitchen where she said she loved to cook for me, even her towel in the bathroom seemed to mock my naivety. And the worst was not the act itself, but the memory of the previous days. How she had been more affectionate, more present, even more loving in bed. I, foolishly, thought it was a rebirth of our love. Now I knew, it was guilt. It was fear of losing comfort while giving herself to another in the shadows. A love divided into two bodies, but with only one betrayal. She tried to call me the next day. She sent messages. She knocked on my sister's door, looked for mutual friends. But I had already made up my mind. For the first time in years, I made a decision thinking about myself. Not about her. Not about what we had built. Because what we had built she had torn down with one gesture. One choice. And there was no cement that could hold together what had been shattered by the lie. She said it was a mistake, that she didn't know what she was doing, that she felt needy, forgotten. But I remembered every effort, every surprise, every weekend planned for the two of us, and I asked myself, how can someone feel alone next to someone who gives everything? Over time, I stopped waiting for explanations. I began to understand that some answers don't come from words, but from actions. She said she loved me, but she loved the forbidden moment more than the life we built. And when she showed up again, weeks later, saying she regretted it, that her lover had left her and that she now realized the colossal mistake she had made, I was a different person. There was still pain inside me, yes. But there was also something new, peace. A peace that no longer depended on her. The irony is that same month, I met someone. Someone who didn't try to be different to impress me, who didn't hide messages on her phone, who laughed sincerely and looked into my eyes as if she wanted to see my soul. And there, in small gestures, I found what I hadn't felt in years, lightness. Clean love. Meanwhile, she kept trying to get back together, as if she wanted to go back to a house she herself had burned down. The cruelest thing about betrayal is not the act itself, but the way it contaminates time. Everything we had lived, everything that was beautiful, now carried the weight of doubt. The kiss on our wedding anniversary, the surprise dinner, the "I love you"s in the dark, which were real. Which were just a rehearsal for the end. Betrayal is a poison that infiltrates the memory, and even if the pain goes away, the bitter taste remains. And when she finally came to her senses, it was too late. Not because time had passed, but because I had. She said she just wanted a different night, that she felt invisible. And that's what she became, invisible to me. While I, who spent years trying to keep her happy, became visible in the eyes of someone who really saw. Not because of status, not because of dependence, but because of true affection. She tried to remind me of the good times, the trips, the plans we made together, but all I could think was, you traded all that for a moment. A single moment. What she didn't realize is that what destroyed our marriage wasn't the other man, it was the disrespect. The choice to walk away, to not talk, to look for what was missing inside her in someone else. Because it wasn't about me, it was about her. And now that the other man has discarded her as if she had never been important, she runs back, but finds a man who no longer belongs to her. Who still carries scars, but who has learned to walk alone. The lesson is as clear as the silence after the storm: you don't exchange an entire story for an episode. The desire passes, but the consequences remain. And while she lamented having lost the man who loved her with all his strength, I discovered the pleasure of being loved by someone who didn't see me as an obligation, but as a choice. She saw me with this new person one afternoon, in the same cafe where we used to go. She came closer, tried to smile, but I just said, "I hope you're okay." It was at that moment that I understood, the true love she once had, was now my love for myself. For the new life. For everything she didn't value. But there is something she never knew, something that may make her understand, too late, what she really lost. And this truth, which remained hidden until the end, may change everything she believed about what we felt for each other. Because in every ending of a story, there is always an untold detail, a silent secret that screams louder than any betrayal. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and never romanticize betrayal. All the stories you hear are fictional, but carry deep emotional truths. The goal is clear: show how betrayal can destroy lives, families and hearts. Get ready, because what comes next is a shocking story, intense and unforgettable. Good story. They met like so many other couples meet, on a random night, without promises, without plans, without imagining that encounter would change the course of their lives forever. Lucas was a calm man with eyes that inspired confidence and a patient manner that charmed everyone who knew him. He worked as a financial analyst at a consulting firm, always methodical, always loyal to the routines he had built with effort. Helena, on the other hand, was the opposite in many ways: restless, sensitive, a creative soul trapped in a body that yearned for freedom. She was a literature teacher at a private school and had the rare gift of transforming the everyday into poetry, the ordinary into enchantment. Together, they created a kind of silent love, the kind that doesn't need to be exposed to be real, that shows itself in the most discreet details of everyday life, in the note left on the mirror, in the way he listened without rushing, or in the way she touched his hand under the table at family dinners. Their relationship began with the intensity that only promising loves have. Their conversations would go on until dawn, and even the silence they shared seemed to have meaning. Neither of them believed in soulmates, but little by little, they began to suspect that perhaps they had met too late, or at just the right time, depending on your point of view. Together, they built a cozy home on a quiet street, surrounded by trees and where time seemed to pass more slowly. Every corner of that house had a story: the old sofa in the living room where they would cuddle up and watch movies on Friday nights, the garden they cultivated together with more love than technique, the shelf with Helena's books mixed with Lucas's reports, as if their worlds had effortlessly intertwined. The first years were marked by an almost childlike enthusiasm. They traveled a lot, tried new flavors, and learned to admire each other's silences. They were never an explosive couple, they didn't need to be. What they had was serenity, a solid foundation built on mutual respect and admiration. And even in difficult times, when money was tight or fatigue seemed greater than affection, they held on tight to each other. When Lucas lost his father and plunged into silent mourning, Helena was there every day, sitting by his side without saying a word, because she knew that sometimes love is more about presence than words. When Helena faced bouts of insecurity as she grew older, Lucas reminded her daily that her beauty lay in her essence, not in her fleeting youth. As the years passed, the routine that so many feared was a blessing for them. The predictability of life as a couple did not tire them, on the contrary, it was what anchored them. They had their quirks, their rituals: breakfast together on Sundays, instrumental music while they read at night, a little improvised dance in the kitchen every time she got a new recipe right. Friends said they were the perfect couple, the rare type that could maintain their enchantment even after so long. And in Suits, there was something about them that conveyed stability. Lucas always said that love was choosing the same person every day, even when the butterflies no longer beat so strongly in the stomach. And Helena, although restless by nature, found in him the refuge that no adventure could offer. That year, they decided to renew their wedding vows in an intimate way. Not out of necessity, but out of a desire to reaffirm their commitment. The ceremony would be simple, just between the two of them, on a carefully planned trip to the countryside, where they could disconnect from the world and remember who they were before the pressures, responsibilities, and invisible demands that time imposes on couples. They prepared everything together. They chose the location, booked the hotel, and carefully arranged every detail. She bought a light, white linen dress, he chose the same blue shirt he had worn on their first date. The idea was to relive, for a weekend, the beginning of everything. To give themselves the gift of time, which so often slipped through their fingers in the commitments of adult life. But not everything was perfect. As with any long-term relationship, there were silent tensions, small cracks that, although discreet, were there. Helena was beginning to feel a different kind of restlessness, something she couldn't name, a constant discomfort with the predictability of her days. Sometimes she would look out the window as if searching for something beyond the horizon. Lucas noticed the longer silences, the unexplained sighs, but he didn't question them. He preferred to believe it was just a phase, an accumulation of tiredness or stress from work. He continued to offer flowers on their wedding anniversaries, preparing her favorite tea before bed, trying to keep alive the flame that, for him, still burned. But for Helena, something inside her seemed to grow cold, not for lack of love, but perhaps due to excessive monotony. And this feeling consumed her in secret. Even so, they never stopped taking care of each other. They still laughed together, still went out to dinner, still had nights of affection and complicity. However, something was different, and they both knew it, they just didn't know exactly what. Helena began to distance herself from deeper conversations. When he asked how her day was, she answered with short sentences. When he suggested a movie, she said she was tired. And little by little, they began to share the same space with less dialogue, less touch, less presence. Lucas insisted. He planned surprises, suggested trips, made compliments. And, for a while, it worked. But like every unilateral effort, there came a point where it ran out. What Lucas didn't know, and perhaps not even Helena consciously knew, is that the dissatisfaction growing inside her wasn't his fault. It was something internal, something she needed to understand herself. She felt trapped between comfort and the desire to rediscover herself. She questioned whether she was still seen as a woman, or just as a wife. If there was still a desire for something new within her, or if she was condemned to repeat the same gestures until the end of her life. Lucas, for his part, remained blind to this silent storm. He believed that, as always, love would overcome everything. That time, patient and constant, would restore what was being lost. And he continued to be there, present, offering more than he received, without realizing that she was, little by little, already moving away. At school, Helena met new people. New ideas. Contact with young teachers, debates on contemporary literature, everything seemed to feed in her mind an old thirst for something that was just hers. There was no malice in her gestures, nor coldness in her way of dealing with Lucas. But there was absence. And over time, even she began to feel guilty for this emotional distance that she didn't know how to reverse. She still admired him. She still respected him. But she no longer knew if she loved him as before, or if she just carried the memory of what they had been. Lucas, on the other hand, kept his hopes alive. He was planning a surprise trip, had consulted a lawyer friend to help with the documents for renewing their vows, and had even thought about writing a new letter by hand, as he had done at the beginning of their relationship. He kept everything to himself, waiting for the right moment. For him, the future still belonged to the two of them. Everything they had built together, all the photos on the walls, all the birthdays celebrated with simple cakes and genuine smiles, still meant everything. He had no idea that love, even when well cared for, could also die of thirst if it was not reciprocated. And so the days went by, with repeated routines, silent attempts at connection, glances that avoided truths. The house remained the same, the garden still bloomed, the sound of the kettle still announced the night. But inside each of them, a different story was being written. Lucas, full of certainties and plans. Helena, full of doubts and silent desires. And without either of them knowing, destiny was already beginning to draw the fine line between love and rupture, between the comfort of home and the abyss of the unknown. What would come next, neither of them was ready to face. And it was precisely at this point of apparent stability, at this moment when everything seemed under control, that life would take its first turn. Lucas began to notice a slight discrepancy between his gestures and Helena's reactions. Small things, almost imperceptible to any outside observer, but obvious to someone who has lived an intimate daily life with someone for years. The kisses began to be more hurried, the conversations less deep, the dinners more silent. There were no fights, there was no explicit coldness, but a subtle and continuous distance, as if her soul was withdrawing, little by little, into itself. He tried to ignore it, then tried to justify it. Maybe it was the stress of work, maybe some concern that she still didn't have the courage to share. Lucas, with his understanding nature, gave space, offered silence, believing that time would heal that which he couldn't even name. But time brought no healing, it only deepened the distance. Helena was immersing herself more and more. There was a restlessness in her that grew with each passing day, an emptiness that she could not fill with what had once been enough for her. The classroom no longer brought her the same enthusiasm, meetings with friends became less frequent and the nights with Lucas became an echo of the past. She respected him, and perhaps that was what kept her tied to the place where she was for so long, but respect was not the same as desire. Her desire seemed to have moved to another point in her existence, something still nameless, faceless, but which manifested itself in silent sighs, lost looks and a longing that she did not know where it came from. It was during a school event that Helena met Andrei, a new sociology professor who had been hired to cover a leave of absence. He was charismatic, articulate, had a subtle sense of humor, and a way of looking at her that made her feel like she was listening to her soul. It wasn't an immediate attraction, but rather a connection that grew through quick conversations in the hallway, through exchanges of messages about literature, through longer glances at team meetings. Somewhere inside Helena, she realized the risk. But she also realized how much she missed being seen, desired, admired not for her constancy, but for her complexity. Andrei made her feel alive in a way she had forgotten was possible. Lucas, on the other hand, continued with his plans. He prepared a surprise to celebrate the next 10 years of marriage, organized the documents for a special trip and kept the hope alive that the turbulent time would pass. He noticed the absent smiles, the glances that escaped his, but he clung to the memory of the good days like a child who refuses to wake up from a beautiful dream. He didn't suspect anything. He had never been jealous or controlling. He trusted Helena with an almost blind faith, the same faith that one has in the solidity of a rock or in the repetition of the sunrise. Over time, Helena and Andrei's encounters stopped being accidental. They became scheduled meetings, initially in coffee shops far from school, then in bookstores, and eventually in hotel rooms. The transition from curiosity to involvement happened almost without her noticing. The first time was filled with guilt, but also with euphoria. She cried on the way home, not because of immediate regret, but because she didn't know how to deal with what she had done. Still, he did it again. Because there was something there that pulled her strongly, something that brought back a forgotten part of herself. Lucas began to feel that something was really wrong when Helena started spending more time away. She claimed meetings, courses, commitments with colleagues, always with plausible explanations, always with a rehearsed smile. He didn't want to doubt. But doubt, once planted, germinates even in the most trusting hearts. One night, when he saw her cell phone vibrate while she was taking a shower, Lucas saw Andrei's name on the screen. Nothing major, just a notification of a deleted message. But it was enough for something inside him to break. He didn't confront Helena. Not yet. But the peace that sustained him dissolved like glass under pressure. The following weeks were marked by a different silence. Lucas began to observe her with different eyes. He noticed her stronger perfumes, her new clothes, her lost gaze after a few nights. He began to rehearse conversations, to create scenarios in his head, to question her every gesture. But at the same time, he insisted to himself that perhaps it was an exaggeration, paranoia, the result of the fear of losing her. He wanted to believe it. But something inside him already knew. Helena, on the other hand, was increasingly immersed in her duality. She spent entire days torn between guilt and desire, between the desire to stop and the inability to let go of what she felt with André. When she was with Lucas, she saw him as a reminder of stability, home, and protection. When she was with André, she felt new, free, and desired. She lived in conflict, but still, she chose to continue. The betrayal was more emotional than physical. She no longer belonged in that home, even though she pretended to. Lucas's voice, once so comforting, now sounded distant. His affectionate gestures seemed to weigh on her skin. And yet, she looked at him with pity, with affection, perhaps even with love, but not the kind of love that sustains a marriage. And Lucas, even though he realized that something was broken, still made plans, still prepared dinners, still dreamed of a trip to start over. It was on a rainy afternoon that fate decided to reveal what no longer fit behind the scenes. Lucas was going out to lunch with his lawyer, a meeting to discuss future investments. A discreet restaurant that he rarely visited. Upon entering, already soaked by the persistent drizzle, he saw a table near the window. Sitting with his lawyer, he looked for the waiter with his eyes. And then, when he turned to the side, his eyes froze. A few steps away, sitting with a wide smile, her fingers intertwined with another man's, was Helena. She didn't see him. She was laughing at something the other man had said, her gaze fixed, complicit. The intimacy between them was impossible to ignore. Lucas felt the blood drain from his face, his stomach churn, as if everything around him had disappeared, except for that scene. The table had become a stage. And what he saw there was not only the confirmation of his suspicions, it was the destruction of everything he believed he had built with her. The pain was immediate, sharp, and without anesthesia. The lawyer noticed and asked if he was okay, but Lucas only mumbled something before standing up. He walked to the table with firm steps, still not knowing exactly what he was going to say. When Helena looked up and saw him, her expression fell. The laughter died in her mouth. The color drained from her face. The man in front of her was visibly disconcerted, but Lucas paid no attention. He looked only at her, and his voice was firm, although filled with pain. He said what he needed to say, with the cruel elegance of someone who has been hurt and has chosen not to retaliate with fury, but with dignity. And at that moment, Helena knew she had crossed a line from which she could not return. She tried to speak, but the words would not come. Lucas, next to the lawyer, declared his decision to go ahead with the divorce. He said he did not hate her, but that there was no longer any room for her in his life. And he left the restaurant as calmly as he had entered, leaving behind not only a shocked woman, but also the very story they had built together. What she did not yet know was that there was something else, something that Lucas had kept silent, something that had not yet been revealed, but that would change everything. Helena spent that night sitting on the floor of the room where she had previously slept with Lucas. She had returned home a few hours after the confrontation in the restaurant, her hands shaking and her face damp with the tears that had been falling ever since she saw him standing in front of her, his gaze that had once been a shelter now filled with farewell. No word she could say would erase the scene she had played out. What she felt was not just guilt, it was a sensation of having destroyed something precious with her own hands, and only when she saw Lucas's empty gaze did she understand the true value of what she had lost. The next morning, he was no longer there. The closet was almost empty, just a few clothes that he had left there on purpose, like someone who is stripping away not only the house, but the very story they had lived there. There was a box on the table with some papers, instructions from the lawyer and a letter written in his own hand. In firm handwriting, he explained that he did not want a confrontation, that he did not hate her, but that he could no longer continue living where he was no longer respected. Helena read the letter dozens of times, looking for something she could object to, but what hurt her most was the lack of resentment. It was as if he had truly given up on her. In the days that followed, she tried to get in touch. She sent messages, called, looked for mutual friends. She never received a response. Andrei, realizing that something had changed, also began to distance himself. Their meetings became more scarce, their conversations colder. Soon, he stopped responding. Helena, with nowhere to hold on, began to revisit the recent past with different eyes. She remembered the first coffee they had together, the spontaneous laughter, the lightness of discovery. But now, all of that seemed shallow, selfish, impulsive. She tried to convince him that they could continue, that what they had was real, but Andrei was blunt. He said that what existed between them was nothing more than a moment, an escape, that he never intended to turn it into real life. She begged him to be honest, and he responded with a phrase that would echo in her head for weeks: "You knew what you were doing." And there, before the end of what had been her escape, she understood that she was alone. More alone than she had ever been. It was only after 2 months, when everything seemed calmer on the outside, that Helena discovered that Lucas had rebuilt part of his life. Not on social media, where he was never present, but through a mutual friend, who mentioned seeing him leaving a coffee shop holding hands with another woman. She didn't want to believe it, but the image wouldn't leave her mind. For days, she found herself obsessed with finding out who he was, where he lived, what he did. She discovered that his name was Clara, that he worked in interior design, that she was divorced and had a small child. And more than that, she discovered that he was someone who seemed to bring lightness to Lucas. One Sunday afternoon, he couldn't resist. He went to the place where he knew he used to go with Clara and waited. When he saw him arriving, her heart skipped a beat. He was different. Lighter, more smiling. The kind of smile she hadn't seen in a long time. When Clara arrived, with the boy running by her side, Lucas bent down to hug the child and kissed the woman tenderly. Helena couldn't bear to watch. She left, unseen, but with a pain that seemed to pierce his chest. It was real. He was moving on. Days later, she decided to confront him. She wanted to at least ask for forgiveness, to say that she regretted it, that it had been a mistake, that she was willing to do anything. She prepared each word, rehearsed her gestures, carefully chose the least flashy, most sober clothing, which would show remorse without seeming like a plea. When she knocked on the door of her new apartment, he was the one who answered. The shock was mutual. Lucas hadn't expected to see her, nor with that devastated expression. For a second, he thought about closing the door, but something in him stopped him. He let her in, and they sat across from each other like two strangers who had once shared a life. She began speaking softly, her voice breaking. She said she knew what she had done, that she understood if he never wanted to look at her again, but that she needed to tell him that she still loved him. That she had lost herself, that she had confused her pain with desires, that she had sought in another what he had always given her sincerely. She asked for forgiveness, not just for the betrayal, but for having made him believe that the problem was in him. Lucas listened to everything in silence, with his eyes fixed, his fists clenched on his knees. When she finished, she asked him to say something, anything. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment and then spoke. He said that she had no idea what she had provoked in him. That he had spent nights awake trying to understand where he had gone wrong, trying to find within himself the reason for being replaced. But that today, sitting there, he no longer felt anger. Only sadness. Because the love he felt for her no longer existed. Helena, overcome with emotion, approached him. She touched his hand and said that she wanted to try, that there was still time, that they could rebuild. It was then that he looked at her with a different look. There was no hurt, no anger, no hope. There was something she had never seen before, pity. And it was at that moment that he decided to tell her. He said that before everything happened, when she was still living her lie, he began to get closer to someone he hadn't seen in years. Someone who, by coincidence or fate, had crossed his path again when he least expected it. He said that this woman was not a stranger, but someone who had once been part of both of their lives. A mutual friend, who had always been close by, but who never had space between them while they were married. A woman who, unlike Helena, knew how to wait. She knew how to respect. Helena, confused, asked if he had been involved with that person before the separation. Lucas denied it. He said he would never do to her what she had done to him. That it all started later, when there was no longer any connection, when he had already buried his feelings. And then, with a coldness that was more cutting than shouting, he revealed that the woman was Clara. And that Clara had been in love with him since college. That they had both drifted apart out of respect for his marriage, but that after everything, they met again by chance, and something pure emerged. Something that did not start with lies. Helena turned pale. The pieces began to fall into place in a cruel way. She remembered Clara at old dinners, the conversations, the looks that at the time seemed like admiration and now seemed like something else. She remembered herself, bored, impatient, while Clara listened to everything Lucas said with genuine attention. He tried to get up, but his legs gave out. He said that this was crazy, that he was just trying to hurt her, that all of this was to make her pay. But Lucas remained calm. He said that there was no revenge, only truth. And that if she wanted to understand how much she had destroyed, here was the answer. She had lost the love of someone who had always loved her, for someone who had never really wanted her. And now, she saw that love blossom somewhere else, in the arms of someone who knew how to wait for the right time. Helena tried to argue, saying that Clara had always been jealous, that perhaps she was manipulating the situation. But Lucas stood up, opened the door and simply said that he no longer needed excuses. That there was no going back. And as she walked down the stairs, feeling the weight of each step like a punishment, she knew that everything she had said was true. She had exchanged the love of her life for a moment. And what was left now was his absence, an irreversible void, filled with everything she had failed to value when there was still time. Helena spent the next few days immersed in a silence that bordered on despair. The world around her continued on its course, people walked the streets, cars passed by, clocks marked the time as they always had, but inside her, everything had stopped. Lucas's revelation was more than a blow, it was a sentence. Clara, the woman she had always considered irrelevant, invisible, secondary, now occupied the place where she had once been everything. It wasn't just the pain of losing the man she loved, it was the weight of realizing that she had been replaced as easily as abandoning an old story on a shelf. But what corroded her most was the knowledge that he hadn't replaced her out of revenge, not out of anger, but because he had simply stopped loving her. That was the most unbearable thing. At the end of that week, she made an impulsive decision. She called Clara. Not to confront her, she no longer had the strength for that, but because she needed to hear from her own voice what Lucas had become. The call was answered after a few seconds of silence. Clara seemed surprised, but remained polite. She agreed to meet her at a discreet cafe in a distant neighborhood, where the past did not overshadow the conversation. When Helena arrived, Clara was already there, sitting with a book on the table and a half-drunk tea. Her face was calm, her gestures soft. No arrogance, no pose of victory. She sat across from her, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. Helena was direct. He said he wasn't there to fight, that he no longer had the energy to argue. He just wanted to understand. Clara listened, took a deep breath and answered sincerely. She said she never intended to be in the middle of anything, that for years she had held on to feelings that she preferred to bury, respecting the life that Helena and Lucas had built. She said they had met again by chance, at an art exhibition, that the conversation flowed as if time had never passed. That he seemed hurt, but willing to rebuild himself. He said they only allowed themselves to do something when they were both sure they weren't betraying anyone. Helena listened to everything with a heavy heart, but she recognized the truth in Clara's voice. There was no resentment in her, only a painful serenity. At the end of the conversation, she stood up, thanked him for his honesty and left the cafe with the certainty that the place that was once hers now belonged to someone else. In the following weeks, she tried to start over. She sought support from friends, went back to therapy, and tried to focus on work. But people's judgmental gaze, even if implicit, weighed heavily on her. The betrayal left a visible scar on her. Some friends drifted away, while others kept in touch out of politeness. School became the only place where she still felt some control, but even then, the memory of André haunted her. He had left school shortly after the scandal. He said he needed a change of scenery, that he wanted to travel. They never spoke again. She realized, with bitterness, that the man she had risked everything for didn't even have the decency to stay. And the irony was cruel, she had exchanged her entire life for someone who didn't even stay to help pick up the pieces. One rainy night, she went to her old neighborhood, without any clear intention. She stopped the car a few blocks from the house where they lived. She watched the lights on, Lucas's silhouette through the window, Clara next to him. She couldn't make out what they were saying, but their gestures were tender. They were smiling. They were at the table, with a glass of wine and an open book. Everything was familiar, but at the same time so distant that it hurt. Watching them was like watching a movie of her own life, only now with different protagonists. She didn't cry. There were no more tears. Just an emptiness, a feeling that she had lived too much in the wrong places, for too long. She returned home in silence, her mind spinning around everything she hadn't said, everything she hadn't done. A month later, fate crossed their paths again. A school event, a ceremony honoring former teachers, brought together several people from the city. Lucas was invited by a former classmate, and Clara accompanied him. Helena, reluctantly, decided to go. She needed to show herself that she was capable of facing them, that she would not be defined by past mistakes. When she entered the hall, everyone's eyes turned. Some whispered, some fake greetings. She walked with her head held high. And then she saw him. Lucas, smiling, holding hands with Clara, chatting naturally with acquaintances. He saw her too, but did not approach. He just nodded, a respectful and restrained gesture. Hours later, when she went out to get some fresh air, she found him alone, near the side garden. For a moment, she thought about leaving, but something stronger made her walk towards him. They remained silent for a few seconds, listening to the sound of the fountain in the background. It was she who broke the silence. She said that she had thought a lot about what he had said at their last meeting. That she now understood what she had done, not only to him, but to herself. That she had spent so much time looking for something outside, when all she really needed was to rebuild herself inside. He listened calmly. He said he held no grudges. That he hoped she would find peace. Helena asked, with a glimmer of hope, if they could ever meet again in another way. Lucas smiled slightly. He said that sometimes life teaches us the hard way what we need to learn. That they had been happy, and for that very reason, they should accept the end with dignity. She wanted to say more, but Clara's presence in the distance reminded her that she was no longer part of that story. She said goodbye with a handshake, a look that carried everything that could not be put into words. He returned home with the feeling that, for the first time, he was truly saying goodbye. Not just to Lucas, but to whoever she had been with him. For the first time in a long time, he slept without dreaming. For the first time, he began to understand that starting over was not about going back to the past, but accepting that it no longer exists. Months passed. Helena didn't rebuild her life as quickly. But she moved to a new neighborhood, painted the walls of her house, and started playing the piano again, something she hadn't done since she was in her early 20s. She was learning to be alone without feeling lonely. Lucas and Clara, on the other hand, were slowly building something solid. Without rushing, without unrealistic expectations. Only with truth. It wasn't about replacing one love with another. It was about allowing herself to live again with someone who knew her silence and still chose to stay. One afternoon, Helena wrote a letter. Not to be delivered. Just to be read by herself. In it, she wrote about choices, about mistakes, about time. She said that she now knew that love is not a flash in the pan, nor euphoria, nor an escape. True love is presence, it is effort, it is commitment. And when we exchange this for something fleeting, we lose more than a partner, we lose the chance to be true to ourselves. She folded the letter, put it in the drawer and went for a walk. The sky was clear, the wind light. For the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of regret transform into learning. And while she was rebuilding herself in silence, Lucas was also following. He didn't look back anymore. Not because he was harsh, but because he understood that some chapters need to be closed with a full stop, not with an ellipsis. And if one day they crossed paths again on another street, with other versions of themselves, perhaps a respectful look, a gentle remembrance would be enough. Because, in the end, all that was left was the certainty that love, when scorned, doesn't scream. It goes away. And when it goes, it never comes back the same. Time, after the fall, doesn't run at the same speed. For Helena, the days seemed to drag the weight of a story that could no longer be told out loud without hurting somewhere that hadn't yet completely healed. There were no more surprises or hopes in her mornings, just a succession of habits that she tried to rebuild with dignity. The routine she once shared with Lucas was now lonely, and every corner of the house seemed to silently testify to her absence. But there was a strange serenity in it, as if, upon reaching rock bottom, I had finally discovered that there was nowhere left to fall. The silence no longer screamed, and the memories stopped hurting and only weighed. Not like knives, but like stones that she learned to carry with less effort. Helena began to dedicate more time to herself. She resumed old forgotten habits, painting, playing the piano, even gardening in the small backyard that had previously seemed irrelevant. She began to walk every morning before work, and in her free afternoons, she went to the bookstore she had once frequented with Lucas, but now she went in alone, without looking for familiar faces. There were times when she felt proud of being able to retrace her steps without depending on anyone, but there were also days when she felt an almost existential emptiness. She was aware that she was becoming a new woman, but she didn't yet know who this version of herself was. The past visited her less, but when it did, it still hurt. What bothered her most now was not Lucas's absence, but the clarity with which she understood her choices. The realization that what she had lost was not taken from her by someone else, but by herself, with her own hands, through distraction, through negligence, through an impulse disguised as freedom. And, most of all, by the pride of not having asked for help when the relationship could still be saved. For months, she pretended that everything was fine, laughed while the love fell apart, and when she finally admitted that something was missing, it was too late. There was no more dialogue, no more reconstruction, only wreckage. Now, she understood that betrayal is not just the physical act, it is, above all, the silent giving up, the growing disinterest, the emotional abandonment that comes before the visible breakup. Lucas, on the other hand, was going through a different process. The pain that once made him lose his appetite, the sleepless nights, the feeling of humiliation that almost turned him into a bitter man, had given way to a kind of mature acceptance. Clara did not replace Helena in his life, she joined a new phase, entered a heart that, although hurt, was still capable of loving sincerely. Their relationship was guided by tranquility and transparency. Unlike in the past, he did not let himself be consumed by expectations, and perhaps because of that, everything flowed more smoothly. Lucas knew that he still carried wounds, but he did not use them as an excuse for fear. He recognized his own weaknesses and spoke about them without shame. Clara listened to him, and this was new to him, being heard without judgment, accepted without pressure. Clara, in turn, understood where she was. She knew she had crossed the line between friendship and love at a delicate moment, but she also knew she hadn't forced anything. Her presence was a consequence, not a cause. There was special care in the way she dealt with Lucas, as if she didn't just want to love, but to heal. And he gradually allowed himself to experience something different with her than he had before. Something softer, more conscious. It was a relationship built on ruins, yes, but where each brick was placed firmly, without haste. And that made all the difference. Still, there was a dilemma that Lucas couldn't avoid. As happy as he was, as promising as the present was, a part of him wondered if he would ever be able to love with the same innocence. Helena's betrayal hadn't made him cynical, but it had made him more attentive, more demanding of himself and others. Sometimes, in silence, I would think about what would have happened if she had talked to me sooner, if she had asked for help, if she had been honest. Not because I wanted to go back, but because the ghost of what could have been still haunted his thoughts on quieter nights. It was a complex feeling. It wasn't a desire to go back, it was just mourning for a story that deserved to have ended differently. Helena, in turn, did not try to interfere anymore. She realized, after that final conversation, that any attempt would be selfish. That love cannot be begged for. That what is broken by betrayal cannot be mended with tears or promises. She understood that Lucas continued not looking back because he had already mourned who she was. And now she needed to bury who she had been with him. She started to take better care of herself, not out of vanity, but out of a need to find herself again. She got rid of old habits, changed her haircut, and remodeled her room. He painted the walls light blue, not to erase the memories, but to start over with a clean slate. For the first time, she learned to be alone without feeling inadequate. The moral dilemma that remained for her was even deeper: how to move on knowing that she had betrayed herself before betraying the other. How to forgive herself not only for hurting someone, but for wasting the chance to be better. It was a guilt that did not call for punishment, but demanded transformation. And Helena, little by little, began to find answers in places she had previously ignored, in books that spoke about forgiveness, in songs that translated what she still could not say, in chance encounters with new people who did not know about her past, and for that very reason, saw her with clear eyes. She did not want to forget what happened, she wanted to learn to live with it without sinking. One afternoon, while visiting an art exhibit downtown, she ran into someone she knew. He greeted her politely and said he hoped she was well. His comment was brief but sincere. Helen replied that she was trying. And for the first time, she felt like she didn't have to justify anything. He didn't apologize, didn't try to explain. He simply calmly stated that he was rebuilding himself. The man nodded, wished her luck, and said goodbye. Helen stood there for a few more minutes, staring at a large canvas with chaotic brushstrokes. And she thought about how her life was like that too, disorganized, but with a beauty that perhaps only revealed itself to those who looked long enough. When she left the gallery, she sat down on a bench in the nearby square. She watched the people, the couples, the children running around. And she realized that the world went on, that pain does not paralyze life, it only invites us to see it with different eyes. She thought about Lucas, about Clara, about everything they had been through. And she did not cry. There was longing, of course, but a longing without despair. A longing that no longer demanded return, only remembrance. And there, on that ordinary bench, Helena understood that she might never love the same way again, but she could love differently. With more awareness, more truth, less fear. Meanwhile, Lucas was preparing a weekend away with Clara and her son. It was their first trip together as something close to a family. He was excited, but also nervous. There was a new responsibility, a silent expectation of living up to it. Clara sensed the weight on his shoulders and eased it with small gestures, a touch on the back of the neck, a light smile, a silly comment at breakfast. And so, without rushing, they began to establish new foundations. Lucas gradually learned to like the boy, not as a substitute for the son he never had, but as someone who was simply part of the life of the woman he now loved. On the road, while he was driving, he thought about everything he had been through. Not with regret, but with a strange gratitude. He knew he wouldn't have gotten there if he hadn't faced all that. The pain had changed him, but it hadn't destroyed him. And that, in itself, was already a victory. Clara, from the passenger seat, asked if everything was okay. He smiled and said yes. And for the first time in a long time, he realized that it was true. Everything was okay. Not perfect, not like before, but okay. A more mature, more whole person. That same night, Helena grabbed her old camera and decided to go out and take pictures of the city. It was a habit she hadn't practiced since college. She walked through dimly lit streets, capturing forgotten details, an open window, a couple dancing at home, a lady watering her plants. She felt alive in a different way. As if, for the first time, she was looking at the world with her own eyes, and not through the lens of a relationship. She was learning to admire life outside the bubble of guilt. And that, for her, was already a new beginning. The seasons began to change. The heat gave way to milder breezes. The city prepared for a new cycle, and with it, the characters in this story. Nothing was the same again, but everything began to make sense. And there was still one last decision to be made, something that would definitively define who each of them had become after the storm. Because the true ending had not yet arrived. But it was getting closer and closer. That October morning, Helena woke up to the light coming through the cracks in the blinds and the distant sound of her neighbor's footsteps dragging trash along the sidewalk. The world outside was still moving, but hers, inside, was beginning to change almost imperceptibly. It was different from the previous months, when she would wake up with a heavy heart and her thoughts spinning in endless circles. Now, there was a kind of inner silence, not the oppressive silence of forced solitude, but the kind that announces a new breath, a pause before taking the next step. She had understood that she could no longer wait for forgiveness that was no longer hers to receive, nor for a chance to return that no longer made sense. And, even without knowing exactly where to go, she knew that she could no longer continue to be the woman who looked out the window waiting for someone to come back. She decided to travel. Not to escape, but to reconnect. She chose a place she had never been, with no ties to the past, where the eyes of others would not recognize her or judge her. A small coastal village, where the sea was as present as the wind, where the simplicity of the people contrasted with the complexity of the emotions she still carried. She rented a modest house, walked along the sand every day at dusk and, little by little, let the salt of the water wash away the last remnants of anguish that still imprisoned her. There, amid the coming and going of the waves and the sound of the seagulls, she rediscovered parts of herself that had been buried by the weight of bad choices. It was on one of these walks that she met Tomas, a widower who painted seashells by the sea and sold them to tourists as souvenirs. He didn't ask many questions, he just offered hibiscus tea in glass cups and let the silence speak for both of them. Helena felt at ease with him. There was no curiosity, no need to know his past. And it was during one of these silent encounters that she commented, without realizing it, about how strange it is to lose someone in life. Thomas didn't ask who she had lost. I simply said, with my eyes turned to the sea, that some losses teach us more than any victory. That certain pains empty us of illusion so that we can truly fill ourselves. Helena smiled. For the first time, without bitterness. Meanwhile, Lucas was also experiencing a moment of introspection. After the trip with Clara and his son, he realized that his life was taking on increasingly solid contours. But he also understood that moving on did not mean erasing what he had experienced. It meant accepting that happiness could take different forms, and that loving again required the courage to let go of one's defenses. Clara, intuitive as always, noticed the change in his outlook. One night when the child was going to bed early, they sat on the couch with 2 glasses of wine and listened to an old song playing in the background. Lucas commented on how, at times, he felt torn between the relief of having overcome the pain and the discomfort of remembering how much he had been hurt. Clara did not try to console him or minimize what he felt. She simply said that loving someone who has been hurt is, above all, respecting the time they need to trust again. The conversation brought them even closer together. It was that same weekend that Lucas invited her to live with him. There was no formal request, no exaggerated romanticism. Just the sincerity of someone who wanted to share their routine, their space, their life. Clara accepted with a restrained smile and a long kiss. It was a new beginning built on truths, where everything was talked about, everything was shared, even their fears. And in that small apartment now shared by 3 people, Lucas rediscovered the meaning of the word home. After 2 weeks in the village, Helena felt it was time to go back. Not because there was something waiting for her, but because she understood that her escape was complete. She had faced herself, and that was enough. When she got home, everything seemed smaller. The silence of the walls, which had previously suffocated her, now seemed like a blank canvas. She began to renovate the rooms one by one, not in a hurry, but with care. She painted the living room olive green, changed the paintings on the wall, replaced the furniture that reminded her of her wedding. Each change was a symbol. Not of forgetting, but of liberation. A new woman was born with each simple decision, with each careful detail. It was during a rainy afternoon that Helena received an unexpected invitation. A letter from the school where she taught informed her about an event that would bring together teachers, parents and former students in honor of the educational project she helped build. She thought about refusing, but then she understood that avoiding this moment would be like denying who she was. Attending did not mean wanting to meet again. It was just another step in the process of taking ownership of her own history. On the night of the event, he dressed simply and with dignity. He arrived early, greeted his colleagues with a discreet smile and listened attentively to the speeches. During the cocktail party, he saw faces he had not seen for a long time. And, unexpectedly, Lucas was there too. Alone. Clara had not accompanied him that night. They had seen each other from afar, and the look they exchanged no longer carried pain. Only recognition. Later, when the hall was empty, they met near the stairs. There was no tension. Just a respectful greeting and a brief conversation, like 2 adults who share a past but do not need to revisit it. Helena talked about the trip she had taken, about how much it had helped her. Lucas talked about moving house, about how he was learning to be a good stepfather, about the boys' swimming lessons. They laughed quietly at an inside joke about an old schoolmate. And then, in silence, they understood that this moment was the confirmation of the end. Not a tragic end, nor a bitter one. A dignified end. The kind that gives way to other beginnings, even if separate. They said goodbye with a brief hug, and each went their separate ways. The following week, Helena wrote an article about loss and reconstruction processes for an emotional education magazine. She did not sign it with her full name, but she knew that whoever read it would feel an intimate truth. She wrote about the danger of getting used to the absence of the other, about how the absence of small conversations and gestures can corrode even the most solid foundations. She spoke about forgiveness, not as a favor to the other, but as a gift to oneself. And she ended with a phrase that came to mind while she was looking out at the sea from the village: sometimes, you have to lose yourself completely in order to finally learn to find yourself. Lucas, reading the article by chance, didn't need to see the signature to know it was hers. He recognized the rhythm of the words, the contained intensity. He showed it to Clara, who also guessed who the author was. Neither of them commented on it for a long time. But that night, Lucas called the school and suggested they buy copies for the seniors. He said that the text had something that everyone needed to read: humanity. Helena, unaware of this, went about her days with a calm she had not experienced for a long time. She was invited to give a lecture in another city, and she accepted without hesitation. And between one coffee and another, between one new chapter of her life and another, she felt that her self-love was truly beginning to blossom. Not because she had gotten over Lucas, but because she had found herself beyond him. The pain that had once seemed to define her was now just a part of what made her up. There was still so much to live, so much to discover. And she was finally ready for it. Time did not go back. The hurts were not erased. But everything was redefined. Because sometimes, it is not about fixing what was broken. It is about building something new with the pieces that are left. And there, in the midst of rebuilding their stories, Helena and Lucas learned that love, when betrayed, can die, but dignity, when maintained, is reborn in other forms, other faces, other futures. And even when separated, they knew they would never be the same. Because what they experienced, in one way or another, changed them forever. And destiny, still silent, prepared the final move, the closure necessary for everything to finally make sense. At the beginning of spring, when the trees were beginning to regain their vibrant green and the air was filled with a gentler breeze, Helena woke up different. There was something pulsing inside her with a new strength, as if the world, after so much falling apart, now offered a real second chance, and no longer an illusion of a new beginning. The time she spent in silence, rebuilding each piece of herself, made her a different woman. No longer the one who lived to be chosen, but the one who now made her own choices with the firmness of someone who had already known the abyss and returned to tell the tale. She still bore scars, of course, some discreet, others deeper, but none defined her anymore. And perhaps it was precisely for this reason that, when she accepted the invitation to speak at a university in another state, she felt that she was finally ready to go beyond everything she had ever been. The trip wasn't just about work, it was also emotional. She would be away for weeks, meeting new people, living in a new city, and for the first time, without any ties. On one of her first mornings there, as she was going out for coffee, she ran into a professor from the institution who, unaware of her story, started a conversation with kindness. His name was Daniel, and he had a calm presence, the transparent gaze of someone who speaks little but thinks a lot. They began to see each other frequently in the hallways, then at quick lunches between lectures, until one afternoon they walked to the city park and talked for hours. He knew nothing about Lucas or her past, and that was liberating. There was no judgment, just presence. Helena felt something new. It wasn't overwhelming passion, nor euphoria. It was peace. A peace that made her want to smile slowly, to build little by little. And there, in that new place, she understood that love can also be born like that, without guilt, without urgency, without fear. Meanwhile, Lucas and Clara had found a delicate but real balance. Their relationship was solid, based on trust and partnership. Clara had become an important figure not only for him, but also for his son, who now called him Lou, with the naturalness of someone who sees him as someone who is here to stay. It was beautiful to see, but Lucas also knew that maintaining a healthy relationship required constant presence and ongoing dialogue. He didn't want to repeat the mistakes of the past, so he made himself truly present. On a special night, during a dinner prepared with love by Clara and decorated with drawings made by the boy, Lucas handed over a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter in which he said, without extravagant promises, that he was ready to be part of that family permanently. Clara, moved, said that she had always known. The relationship was made official weeks later, in a simple and intimate event, surrounded only by those who mattered. There was no ostentation, but there was love in every detail. Helena found out about the wedding on Instagram from an old colleague. She saw the photo of Lucas smiling, in a light-colored suit, next to Clara and the boy, all holding hands. She didn't feel jealous. There was no pain. There was just a kind of silent nostalgia, as if she were looking at an old house where she had lived and that now belonged to other people. She closed the app, made a coffee, and went back to writing. Her book was almost ready. A narrative about reconstruction, about self-love, about choices. A work that mixed fiction and reality, and that, for her, was more than a literary work, it was the synthesis of what she had learned. When she launched the book months later, she was surprised by the presence of Daniel in the front row. He had traveled to her city just to see her speak. After the event, he hugged her tightly and said, bluntly, that he no longer wanted to be just part of a chapter. He wanted to be present in the entire story that she would still write. Helena, for the first time, didn't hesitate. She accepted. Some time later, already in a stable relationship with Daniel, she received an unexpected email. It was from André. Short and direct. He simply said that he was sorry, that he knew how much of a coward he had been and that, somehow, he needed to say this. Helena read it, thought about it and decided not to respond. Not out of pride, but because she understood that some responses were no longer necessary. She had already ended that cycle. I no longer needed to hear excuses to move on. She had forgiven, but she had forgiven herself. And that was enough. Lucas, now married, lived simpler and lighter days. Clara, attentive to details, made sure the house always smelled of a cake in the oven and laughter spread throughout the rooms. Sometimes, at night, they would walk around the neighborhood with the boy, and Lucas would find himself thinking that he never imagined that happiness would come precisely after the deepest pain. He knew that he would never forget everything he had experienced with Helena, but he also knew that life does not require us to erase the past, only that we do not carry it like a chain. And he had learned to let go, without resentment, without guilt. Years passed. Helena published another book, this time with her full name on the cover. She was invited to international events, began mentoring, and founded an institute to help women in the process of emotional reconstruction. She became a point of reference. But more than that, she became free. Not only from the judgment of others, but from the internal prison she carried. She no longer felt the need to explain her mistakes. They were part of the path that brought her there. Daniel accompanied her on her travels whenever he could. And in the moments when they were not together, she knew that there was no distance between two people who share the truth. One late afternoon, while walking alone through a book fair, she met a young woman with a curious look in her eyes, holding one of her books. He approached her, smiled, and started a conversation. The woman said that she read his words whenever she felt like she was sinking. That she found a mirror, a light in them. Helena thanked him with emotion and, as she said goodbye, she thought about how many lives had been touched by the pain that had almost destroyed her one day. And she understood, once and for all, that there is no suffering in vain when you choose to transform it into learning. As for Clara, she found in Lucas what she had only dreamed of for years. A sincere, present, respectful love. She knew that their pasts were full of shadows, but she chose to focus on the light they had built. She began working on social projects and saw in her son the reflection of a childhood she herself had never had. Together, they built a home where respect was the foundation. And there, in their daily lives, in their silent affection, in their care for small gestures, they lived a love that did not shout, but sustained. In the end, each followed the path they chose, with the consequences that shaped them. Helena rebuilt, Lucas was reborn, Clara flourished. André continued, perhaps without ever finding what he was looking for. And what remains of this story is a clear message: those who betray destroy not only the other, but parts of themselves. Love requires courage, presence, honesty. When you exchange what you have built for a moment of ego, you lose much more than you imagine. And sometimes, there is no going back. Because not everything that breaks can be put back together. But everything you learn can help to ensure that it never happens again. If you've listened this far, comment below what you thought of this story. Share your opinion, your feelings, your vision about all of this. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories that are yet to come. This story was a profound reflection on how betrayal is a wound that goes far beyond the moment. It shakes the present, corrupts the past, and risks the entire future. Cheating is not just breaking up with the other person, it is breaking up with what you have built, with trust, with your own worth. There is no beauty in betrayal. There is pain, regret, emptiness. And no matter how much life goes on, it will never be the same again. This channel does not support and will never romanticize any type of betrayal. Here, we clearly show that the price of infidelity is too high, and the one who pays, often, is not only the one who was betrayed. It is also the one who betrayed. Until the next story.